From the moment I could understand things, it was clear that my older brother Tommy was the golden child, and I was just there. The girl, the afterthought. "Nicole, make sure you're home by 3:30 to help your brother with his lunch," Mom would say almost every morning before school. I was 12, Tommy was 15, and apparently, making a sandwich was too difficult for the family prodigy. "But Mom, I wanted to join the art club after school," I'd plead, knowing it was useless. "Your brother has football practice. He needs proper nutrition. You know how important that is for him." She'd give me that look, the one that said the discussion was over before it began. Meanwhile, Tommy would be sprawled on the couch, his latest iPhone in hand, a birthday gift that made my hand-me-down flip phone feel like a relic from another century. "Yeah, Nikki," he'd smirk, not even looking up from his screen, "be a good sister." Dad was even worse about it. "Nicole, this is good practice for when you're a wife," he'd say, as if that was the pinnacle of what I could aspire to. A woman needs to know how to take care of her family. Every day was the same routine. I'd rush home from school, throw together whatever Tommy wanted to eat, iron his clothes for the next day, and try to squeeze in my homework between chores. While I was doing all this, Tommy would be at one of his many after-school activities: football, debate club, computer programming classes. Mom and Dad made sure he had every opportunity available. The only person who seemed to really see me, was Grandma Rose. Her old Victorian house on the other side of town became my sanctuary. Every weekend I'd bike over there, pedaling fast through the tree-lined streets until I saw her distinctive wraparound porch come into view. "There's my girl," she'd call out from her garden, her silver hair gleaming in the sun. Inside her house, there was no hierarchy, no golden child. Just warmth, cookies, and the kind of love that didn't come with conditions. Grandma Rose's house was like something out of an old movie, all creaky floorboards, carved wooden banisters, and rooms full of fascinating treasures. Sure, the wallpaper was peeling in places, and some of the windows stuck when you tried to open them, but I loved every imperfect inch of it. It felt more like home than our pristine suburban house ever did. What made it special wasn't just the building itself, but how Grandma treated us when we were there. Whether it was Christmas, birthdays, or just a regular weekend visit, Tommy and I always got the same treatment. Same size cookies, same loving hugs, same thoughtful gifts. It drove Tommy absolutely crazy. I'll never forget the day it all came to a head. It was Tommy's 16th birthday, and Grandma had gotten us both new tablets, nice ones, but identical. Tommy took one look at his and exploded. "Are you kidding me?" He stood up, face red with anger. "Nicole gets the exact same thing as me? On my birthday?" Grandma Rose sat calmly in her antique armchair, hands folded in her lap. "Tommy, dear, I love you both equally. But that's not fair," he was practically shouting now. "Mom and Dad always give me better stuff. They know I deserve it. I'm the one with the grades, the sports achievements, the future. Nicole just exists." I felt like I'd been slapped, but before I could say anything, Grandma Rose stood up. She wasn't a tall woman, but in that moment, she seemed to tower over all of us. Thomas Michael Parker, her voice was quiet but sharp as a knife. "You will not speak about your sister that way in my house. Or anywhere else, for that matter. I will not allow it." Tommy stormed out, slamming the front door so hard that Grandma's collection of china teacups rattled in their cabinet. I expected that to be the end of it, but it wasn't. The next day, Grandma showed up at our house unannounced. I sat at the top of the stairs, listening to her talking to Mom and Dad in the living room. Her voice carried clearly, "The way you're raising these children is unacceptable. The favoritism needs to stop." "Mom, we're doing what's best for both of them," my mother tried to argue. "Really? Is that what you call it?" Grandma's voice was cold. "Well, if you want my continued financial support for their upbringing, things need to change." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Later that night, I overheard Mom and Dad talking in their bedroom. "We can't afford to lose her money," Mom was saying. "We need it for Tommy's college fund, for all his activities. I know, Dad sighed. We'll have to play along. Give Nicole some stuff too. Keep your mother happy. Suddenly, everything changed. Within a week, I was enrolled in the piano lessons I'd been begging for since I was 10. A new iPhone appeared on my bedside table. My parents started asking about my day at dinner. The next time I visited Grandma, she was tending to her roses in the garden. She looked up at me with a knowing smile. You know, dear, she said, pruning shears in hand, I get detailed reports of how every penny of my support money is spent. Your parents seem to be making much better choices lately, don't you think? It's a strange feeling when you realize your parents' love comes with conditions. Yes, they were going through the motions, asking about my day, buying me things, showing up at my school events, but their hearts weren't in it. Their eyes would still light up differently when Tommy walked into the room. I learned to accept it. At least now I had my piano lessons and didn't have to spend every afternoon being Tommy's personal maid. Sometimes acceptance is easier than hoping for change. When Tommy graduated high school and got accepted to State University 3 hours away, you'd think he'd won the Nobel Prize. Mom and Dad threw this huge party, invited all the relatives, made speeches about their brilliant son. Grandma Rose sat in the corner, watching it all with those knowing eyes of hers. For the first few months, all we heard during family dinners was how well Tommy was doing at college. He'd call home weekly, telling stories about his classes, his professors, his bright future in business. Mom and Dad would put him on speakerphone, beaming with pride. Then came the letter. I was in my senior year of high school when Dad stormed into the house waving an official-looking envelope, his face purple with rage. Tommy was on academic probation, at risk of being expelled. Turns out all those study sessions he'd been talking about were actually parties. He'd barely attended any classes. Grandma Rose showed up the next day. I'd never seen her so angry. If you don't get that boy in line, she told my parents, her voice like steel, don't expect me to pay for another college when he gets himself kicked out of this one. And believe me, no other school will take him with these grades. The threat of losing Grandma's money sent my parents into a panic. They drove to State University that very weekend. I don't know exactly what they said to Tommy, but when he called the following week, he sounded different. Subdued. For once in his life, Tommy had to face actual consequences. By some miracle, Tommy managed to pull his grades up enough to stay in school. He graduated 4 years later and decided to stay in that city, taking a job at a local company. Meanwhile, I'd gotten into the business management program at City College, just 20 minutes from home. Grandma Rose paid my tuition too, though my parents barely seemed to notice I was in college at all. When I made the dean's list, the only celebration was a phone call with Grandma. 4 years flew by, and suddenly I was graduating with honors. Grandma was there, of course, beaming proudly. My parents showed up too, though they spent most of the ceremony talking about how Tommy was doing at his new job. I didn't care anymore. I had my degree, and better yet, I had a job offer from Parker and Associates, one of the biggest marketing firms in town. When Grandma Rose passed away, it felt like the world stopped spinning for a while. The day of her funeral, I couldn't stop staring at her garden, wondering who would tend to her beloved roses now. The reading of the will was held in her attorney's office, a week after the funeral. Tommy flew in from out of state, wearing an expensive suit that somehow still made him look like a kid playing dress-up. Mom and Dad sat between us, as if they were still needed as buffers after all these years. Mrs. Rose Parker's estate, the attorney began, adjusting his glasses, is to be divided between her 2 grandchildren, Nicole and Thomas Parker. He paused, looking at both of us. The division is to be determined by their own choice. One will receive the house, and the other will receive a sum of $500,000. The first choice goes to Thomas, as the elder grandchild. Tommy actually snorted. Is this some kind of joke? He looked around the room. You really expect me to want that musty old house? No, I'll take the money, I've got plans. I'm going to start my own business, show everyone what I can do. Nicole can have the old lady house with all its weird smells and creaky floors. I sat there, my heart pounding. The house. Grandma's house. My sanctuary all those years. I'll take it, I said quietly, but firmly. The next few years passed in a blur of hard work and determination. At Parker and Associates, I threw myself into every project, every challenge. My team's sales numbers kept breaking records, and within 3 years, I was promoted to head of sales. The salary increases that came with my success went straight into renovating Grandma's house. I took my time with the renovation, carefully preserving the house's character while modernizing everything else. New wiring, new plumbing, a state-of-the-art kitchen that still somehow felt like it belonged in a Victorian home. The garden I did myself, learning everything I could about roses, and continuing Grandma's legacy. Mom and Dad came to visit once it was done. I watched their faces as they walked through the restored rooms, saw how their eyes widened at the crown molding, the hardwood floors, the gourmet kitchen. "This is incredible." Mom ran her hand along the marble countertop. Dad nodded, then sighed. "It's a shame Tommy didn't take the house. This would have been perfect for him and his new wife." And there it was. Some things never change. "Speaking of which," Mom added, trying to sound casual, "have you heard from your brother lately?" I hadn't, of course. None of us had been invited to his wedding 6 months ago. He'd gotten married in his wife's hometown, surrounded by her family and their mutual friends. Mom had shown me pictures she'd found on Facebook, Tommy in a tux, his new wife Rebecca beaming in designer white. The doorbell rang on a Sunday afternoon while I was pruning Grandma's roses. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I took my time wiping the dirt from my hands before heading to the door. When I opened it, I nearly dropped my gardening gloves. There stood Tommy, looking nothing like the competent businessman he'd been pretending to be on social media. Beside him stood a woman I recognized from the wedding photos, Rebecca, his wife. She wore designer clothes and too much makeup, her eyes scanning my home like she was conducting an inspection. Tommy gave me an apologetic look. "Can we talk privately for a minute, Nikki?" We stepped into Grandma's old study, now my home office. Tommy closed the door behind us and turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before, desperation. "I need your help, sis," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The business, it's not good. We're about to lose everything. We had to give up our apartment, and..." He ran his hands through his hair. "Could we stay here for a while? Just until things turn around?" I stood there, stunned. Tommy had never asked me for anything before, unless you count all those years of demanded lunches and ironed clothes. "Please," he added, and for the first time since we were kids, I saw my brother instead of my parents' golden child. "Okay," I heard myself say. "But just temporarily." The next morning, my doorbell rang again. This time it was Mom and Dad, practically bouncing with excitement. We came as soon as Tommy told us. Mom rushed past me to embrace Rebecca. "Oh, sweetheart, we're so happy to finally meet you in person." For the next 2 hours, I might as well have been invisible. I served coffee, at Mom's imperious request, and listened as Rebecca charmed my parents with stories about her family's social connections and Tommy's brilliant business ventures. "Nicole," Mom called out as I headed to the kitchen, "be a dear and make us some lunch." Something nice, Rebecca's used to fine dining. That set the tone for the weeks that followed. I'd come home from long days at work to find Tommy and Rebecca lounging in my living room, expecting dinner to magically appear. "Aren't you going to start cooking?" Rebecca asked one evening, not looking up from her phone. "We're starving." "I just worked a 12-hour day," I replied, dropping my briefcase. "Why don't you cook something?" Rebecca's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me? You should be grateful we let you stay here at all. The least you could do is cook decent meals." I turned to Tommy, confused. He pulled me into the study again. "Look," he whispered urgently, "Rebecca thinks this is my house. She thinks I'm letting you stay here out of kindness. She comes from money, she's used to a certain lifestyle. If she finds out I'm basically bankrupt, his voice cracked. She'll leave me. I stared at my brother, this man who'd had everything handed to him his whole life, now reduced to begging me to lie to his wife. Fine, I said finally. I won't tell her. But you two need to start treating me with respect in my own home. No more demands, no more attitude. Deal? Deal, Tommy nodded quickly. Thank you, Nikki. I mean it. True to his word, Tommy's demands for home-cooked meals stopped. Instead, I'd come home to find takeout containers from the city's finest restaurants scattered across my kitchen counter. Rebecca would be lounging on my sofa, picking at pad thai or sushi, barely acknowledging my presence. I didn't ask questions. Honestly, I was just relieved not to be playing chef after long days at the office. I settled into my own routine, grabbing dinner from the casual cafe near work. The arrangement seemed to be working. They stayed out of my way, I stayed out of theirs. Then came the phone call. Nicole? Mom's voice had that tone, the one she used when she was about to demand something. We need to discuss the restaurant bills. Tommy told us you'd cover the expenses at the end of the month. It's nearly $3,000. I nearly choked on my coffee. Excuse me? Well, you can't expect them to starve, Mom continued, as if this was the most reasonable thing in the world. Tommy said you agreed to handle their food expenses since they're going through a rough patch. I've been putting it all on my credit card. I'll text you the account details for the transfer. I hung up. My hands were shaking as I pulled up my text messages and sent one to Tommy. Come to me, now. He must have heard something in those 2 words, because he appeared in my study within 15 minutes. Rebecca was out shopping, with whose money, I didn't want to know. Care to explain why Mom thinks I'm paying for your 5-star takeout habit? I asked, my voice deadly quiet. Tommy's face did that thing it used to do when we were kids and he got caught in a lie, a quick flash of guilt before the excuses started flowing. Nikki, you have to understand. Understand what? That you're stealing from our parents now too? I'm not stealing, he ran his hands through his hair. I just borrowed. I was going to pay them back when things turned around. But Rebecca, she has certain expectations. If she knew how bad things really are. Stop, I held up my hand. I've heard enough about Rebecca's expectations. This ends now. I'll figure something out, he promised, his eyes pleading. Just give me more time. Don't tell Rebecca, please, Nikki. I've never asked you for anything. Never asked me for anything? I stood up, my voice rising. Are you kidding me? My entire childhood was spent catering to your needs. And now you're living in my house, lying to your wife, and scamming our parents. I know, he held up his hands. I'm sorry, really. Just one more chance. I'll handle the restaurant bills. I promise. I stared at my brother, this man who had everything handed to him his whole life, now reduced to begging his little sister to keep his house of cards from collapsing. Fine, I said finally. One more chance. But I mean it, Tommy. Figure out your own food situation. And I'm not paying a cent of those bills. Life fell into an uncomfortable routine over the next 2 months. I'd go to work, manage my department, come home to find my house looking like a hurricane had swept through it, and spend my evenings cleaning up after Tommy and Rebecca. They seemed to exist in their own bubble of leisure, lunches with our parents, dinners at expensive restaurants, shopping trips I didn't want to know the details of. Then came the day that changed everything. Tommy had left early, muttering something about a business meeting. I came home from work earlier than usual, having wrapped up a major sales presentation, looking forward to a quiet evening with a glass of wine. Rebecca was waiting for me in the living room, perched on the edge of the sofa like a queen about to deliver a royal decree. We need to talk, she announced, gesturing to the armchair across from her. Sit. I raised an eyebrow at her tone, but sat down anyway. Might as well hear whatever this was about. I've been patient, Rebecca began, examining her manicured nails. I've watched you swagger around this house like you own the place, making everyone uncomfortable. But enough is enough. I blinked. Excuse me? From now on, you'll pay us $2,000 a month in rent. That's more than fair, given the neighborhood. She smiled tightly. And you'll resume cooking and cleaning duties. The state of this house is embarrassing, and since you're the tenant. I couldn't help it. I started laughing. Not a polite chuckle, but full-blown, tears in my eyes laughter. Rebecca's face darkened. What exactly is so amusing? I wiped my eyes, trying to catch my breath. Rebecca, honey, there seems to be a misunderstanding. This is my house, I own it. Your husband is living here because I took pity on him when he came begging at my door. The color drained from her face. You're lying. Call him, I said, leaning back in my chair. Go ahead. Ask Tommy who owns this house. Her hands shaking slightly, Rebecca pulled out her phone and dialed. Tommy answered on the second ring. Darling, her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Nicole is spinning some ridiculous story about owning the house. Tell her she's mistaken. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. She's telling the truth, Tommy's voice crackled through the speaker. It's her house. Grandma left it to her in the will. I took the money instead to start a business, but I failed. We're broke. I've been trying to find a way to tell you. Rebecca stood up so fast, she knocked over her water glass. I watched as she stormed upstairs, heard drawers slamming, closet doors banging. Within 20 minutes, she was dragging her designer suitcases down my stairs. She didn't say a word as she left. The slam of the front door echoed through the house like a gunshot. The morning after Rebecca left, I was enjoying my coffee in peaceful silence when Tommy burst through the front door. His face was twisted with rage, all traces of yesterday's contrition gone. This is all your fault, he shouted, stalking into my kitchen. Rebecca's filing for divorce. She won't even talk to me. You had no right to tell her the truth. I set my coffee cup down carefully, remembering all the times I'd backed down from his anger over the years. Not this time. No, right? I stood up slowly. This is my house, Tommy. The house you laughed at me for choosing. The house you said smelled like an old lady. The house you've been lying about to your wife while mooching off our parents. And you're telling me I had no right? You ruined everything. He slammed his fist on my counter. You've always been jealous of me, haven't you? Always waiting for a chance to get back at me. Get out. My voice was quiet but firm. Take your things and go. He stared at me for a moment, then stormed upstairs. I listened to him throwing things around in the guest room, probably breaking something expensive. I didn't care. When he came back down with his bags, he gave me one last venomous look. I had exactly 1 hour of peace before my phone rang. Mom's name flashed on the screen. How could you do this to your brother? She didn't even say hello. He's devastated. He's back home with us now, crying his eyes out. That's not my problem. Of course it's your problem. Dad's voice now, they had me on speaker. You need to give Tommy the house. It's the only way to save his marriage. Rebecca might come back if they have a proper home. I actually laughed. Are you serious? You want me to give away my house because Tommy lied to his wife and ruined his business? He's your brother. Mom was practically shrieking now. Family helps family. Really? I felt a lifetime of resentment bubbling up. Where was that family spirit when I was cooking and cleaning for Tommy as a kid? Where was it when you ignored my achievements because you were too busy praising him? The only person who ever treated me like family was Grandma, and she left this house to me. This conversation is over. 2 months later, I heard through work colleagues that Tommy's company had officially declared bankruptcy. His divorce was finalized around the same time. He was living with our parents, apparently regrouping, their favorite word for Tommy's failures. I wasn't surprised when all 3 of them showed up at my door one Sunday afternoon. Mom was clutching a casserole dish like a peace offering. Dad had that stern look he used to use when he was about to lecture me about family duty. Tommy stood behind them, trying to look pitiful. I watched them through the security camera Grandma had installed years ago. They rang the bell again and again. Mom started calling out, "Nicole, we know you're in there. We need to talk about this as a family." I picked up my phone and sent a single text to all three of them, "Please leave. Do not come back. This is your only warning before I call the police." They left eventually, but not before Mom left the casserole on my porch with a note about forgiveness and family obligations. I donated the casserole to the homeless shelter down the street. These days, my life is peaceful. I tend to Grandma's roses, which are blooming more beautifully than ever. My career is thriving. I made Executive VP last month. I feel good, and it's all thanks to Grandma.